Hello everybody, if we have any viewers currently. We'll give it a couple minutes. There's one viewer. Alright, gonna wait a couple minutes until people joining, but thanks for tuning in, those 6 of you so far. How's everybody doing today? All right, hello Ann, good to hear that the audio is working well. This is only my second official Facebook Live, so I'm still working some things out. Obviously, we'll be getting better at this. We got Sarah in our background, our director, stopping to look through the window. How you doing? I'll probably give it 2 minutes for some people before we start. If you are tuning in for the first time, I did a Facebook Live with my coworker Emma last Thursday that was on zooplankton. This one is going to be more focused on phytoplankton. If you want to see that, you can look back on our Marine Lab Facebook page and you can watch all of the previous Facebook Live videos. This one is going to be the last one in Citizen Science Week. Nicole, how you doing? All right, 1 more minute, and then if you snooze, you lose. I'll start. So hopefully some of you have tuned into the other Facebook Live Citizen Science Weeks we've done. We've had them all week, Monday through Friday. So if you haven't, go back and check them out. Definitely some very good information in there. All right, so like I mentioned, this is the last week or the last day of Citizen Science Week. Thank you all if you've tuned in. Hopefully you guys are realizing that you don't need to be some super fancy scientist to help out the environment. Regular ordinary citizens can do a lot to help out. So this one too, specifically about harmful algal blooms, is something that regular ordinary citizens can easily participate in, and I'll be explaining all about that in just a sec. So, if we're talking about harmful algal blooms, we have to talk about phytoplankton. If you listen to my little Facebook Live last Thursday about zooplankton, you'll know that plankton is an organism that cannot swim against the current. So a lot of these are very small, but some of them are not. Some plankton are larger, like jellyfish. They are considered plankton, they cannot swim against the current. So that's why you will see a lot of jellyfish washed up on the beaches. If we're talking about phytoplankton, those are your plant-like plankton. There's phytoplankton and there's zooplankton. Zooplankton is your animal plankton. So for phytoplankton, there are a few reasons why they are really important. Number one, they are absorbing CO2, carbon dioxide. So they photosynthesize. These tiny, tiny little plankton photosynthesize, and through that process, they are able to take in carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. And it's actually surprising how much oxygen these little phytoplankton produce. They are responsible for producing at least 50% of all the oxygen we use on Earth. Some scientists say as high as 75. We know it's at least 50. It's hard to get an exact number because of how small these phytoplankton are and how big our oceans are. But they know it's at least 50% of all the oxygen on our Earth is from phytoplankton. So next time you take a deep breath, you can thank our phytoplankton for that. They are also the bottom of the food chain. Very important. They're the base of the food chain. You wouldn't have a food chain, a marine food chain, without phytoplankton. So how does that relate to harmful algal blooms? Phytoplankton are good. They're natural. You're going to find them everywhere. It's when they bloom out of control that they can cause an issue. So certain species of phytoplankton can be toxic, certain ones can be harmful, and it's when those really bloom that's when it can cause a lot of issues to our environment. So one of the things that can cause the bloom, there's actually a couple, kind of like a combination of factors. You'll have temperature, the right temperature, sunlight, and most importantly nutrients, and that can cause a phytoplankton bloom. Now that bloom, if you're looking with your naked eye, you cannot see phytoplankton at all. They are extremely tiny. You have to look under a microscope to see them. But if you get a bloom where there is, millions and billions of them, you'll be able to see them. It will kind of turn the water a different color. So if we are talking about how these blooms occur, if you add nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen into the water, that's really going to drive phytoplankton to reproduce a lot faster than they usually would. How they reproduce, they just divide, they split apart. So that usually happens once every 48 hours. That's a normal time, that's a good time. But if you add all these extra nutrients, then they might split every 24 hours. So you're doubling and doubling and doubling, and soon they are out of control. So what are some causes of excess nutrients? Well, humans actually have a lot to do about that. So if you think of sewage, of waste, that has phosphorus and nitrogen, those nutrients are what phytoplankton love. If you're talking about runoff from fertilizers and farms, have tons of nutrients that phytoplankton love. So these harmful algal blooms, they've been around. It's not like they're just a new thing. They've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But recently we found that when humans are adding to that issue, these blooms last longer and they're more severe. So especially if you are in Florida, you have definitely know about what people call red tide. That is one type of harmful algal bloom. So that's caused by one specific type of phytoplankton. That type, the one that causes red tide, is named Carenia brevis, named after Karen, the scientist who did a lot of work on it. So that's just one type. There's tons of different types of harmful algal blooms that can happen. And that's why we kind of like to use the word harmful algal bloom, because there's more than just red tide. A harmful algal bloom isn't always going to be red either. It can be green, it can be brown. So, and there's also another thing that can cause these blooms called blue-green algae, if you've heard of that, or cyanobacteria. So that's similar to phytoplankton, but it's actually closely related to bacteria. And it is a photosynthetic bacteria, so that's actually pretty unique. But the same idea, if you're feeding them extra nutrients, they will bloom, and then all of a sudden you have either your pond or the beach is going to be covered. It could be green, it could be red, it could be brown, but it's going to cause a lot of damage. So I mentioned fertilizers and runoff from farms. There's also this big lake in the middle of Florida called Lake Okeechobee. And as people started to settle into Florida about like 200 years ago, Florida, it's very wet. If you're watching from out of state, maybe you don't know that. If you're in Florida, you definitely know the summer months are wet months. So when that happened, Lake Okeechobee would flood, it would kind of mess with everyone's farms and if they had a house there. So people started diverting the water. Eventually it came straight down from Lake Okeechobee, all the way down south through Florida, through the Everglades, and then out into the Florida Bay, which is below the state of Florida. And that's good. The Everglades actually filtered the water. All those natural plants, they filter out the nutrients, nice and healthy. So when we diverted the water, instead of going all the way south from Lake Okeechobee, people settled south. So they wanted the water to go east and west. So we diverted the water to go out to the west coast of Florida and to go out to the east coast a little bit. So if you're on the west coast of Florida, because so much of that water from Lake Okeechobee is draining into the west coast, that is a big kind of indicator of these algae blooms. Lots of nutrients get run off through there. And the issue with that is there's not the Everglades to filter it anymore. So all those nutrients are going right into the water instead of getting naturally filtered by the Everglades. So why are these blooms harmful? Like I said, you won't be able to see the individual phytoplankton without a microscope, but when they're so grouped together and so thick, it will kind of turn the water a red or a green or a brown. And sometimes they can be toxic. So red tide is toxic. They give off this toxin. It messes with people's respiratory systems. Same thing with birds and animals and all your fish in the ocean. So that's why if you're at the beach when there's red tide, you will unfortunately see a lot of dead animals. So some of these blooms could be toxic. Sometimes they aren't toxic, but they're so thick that they're covering up everything. So they're covering almost like in a top layer on the ocean, and then everything below it is not getting sunlight, and that can kill seagrasses, it can kill other plants. And a third thing that's really unfortunate about these red tides and harmful algae blooms is when they die. Once they're decomposing, it sucks all the oxygen out of the water. So all of these massive blooms, when they die off, then there's no oxygen there. So any marine life that is in the area, they're not going to be able to breathe, and that causes more wildlife death, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk about what Marine Lab does to kind of monitor this situation, and also what you can do to help. So Marine Lab, we are part of the Phytoplankton Monitoring Network. That is through NOAA, and I will show you our data sheet. So when we get students here, sometimes they participate in this activity, and also Marine Lab staff will do that. So here is a data sheet, and I will explain that in just a sec. So we report all of our information through NOAA. So we work in partnership with them for these algae blooms, and NOAA is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. So it's important to get the information to experts. They're the experts, so we will kind of send what we have. They'll double check and make sure everything works out. So what we do is we'll take a sample, which I did. I went towing, and we have a net that we'll tow with, and then eventually we'll filter out the plankton, put it under the microscope, and you can see behind me, this is one type of phytoplankton right here. If you are looking online, you can look at that data sheet that was provided for you. I listed about 10 of the common harmful algae blooms, just their specific species. So if you're looking at that data sheet that you have online for this activity, you might be able to notice it. See if you're able to identify this right here. It's definitely on the sheet. And what we'll do is we will try to go through and look, see if is there an abnormal amounts of a certain type of phytoplankton. If there is, then we record the data, we send it into the experts at NOAA, and we'll do more sampling and more testing. So let's say, what would a bloom look like under the microscope? It would be a lot more than this. We're talking like everything would be covered under the slide. You would not be able to see pretty much anything except that algae. That's how thick these blooms can be. And not only Marine Lab, like we do a good job helping with it, but anybody can help, and that's where the citizen science comes in. So let's say you have a pond in your backyard, a retention basin, you're by a big body of water like a lake or a river. What you can do to kind of help reduce the severity of these algal blooms is, one, you can use less fertilizer. Fertilizer is kind of rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. That's the nutrients that these phytoplankton love and will bloom and can cause these toxic blooms. So if you're fertilizing your lawn a lot, that's not good for the environment. If you have a septic tank or there's sewage leaking out, that's going to eventually make its way into the water, and that's going to be bad for the oceans, bad for the environment as well. It's going to lead to these blooms. And by the way, guys, if you have any questions during this, feel free to type them up on the screen. And after I get through this, we're going to actually see if we can find some other species on here, identify any target species of phytoplankton that we might want to send in for further analysis. So what else can you do to help? Well, I would say this. A lot of people, if they have a pond or a retention basin like on their property or in their yard, a lot of people like to kill everything in it. They see plants growing, they see, bigger algae in there growing, and they want it all sprayed, they want it dead, they want their pond to almost look like a reflecting pool, be that clear. The issue with that is that once you do that, you spray these chemicals to kill all the healthy plants, the native plants, there is nothing to filter out the nutrients. And where is the pond or retention basin going to drain into? It's going to go to a pipe, it's going to go to a canal, and then a river, a stream, and then eventually make its way into the ocean. So if you killed all those healthy plants around your ponds, you have nothing to filter those nutrients, and that's going to lead to more algae blooms. So a lot of people, they don't like the look of it, but really that's what a healthy pond is supposed to look like. It's supposed to have lots of plants in there to help absorb all these nutrients. So guys, I'm going to take a look here at some of these phytoplankton. If you were wondering, this one right here, right here, is called Catasaurus. So it actually chains together. This is not a toxic one. So if you were on the beach, like the red tide one, the one that causes red tide, Corinia brevis, that one is toxic, meaning if you're breathing it in, it's going to cause you a lot of respiratory issues. This one is not toxic, but it can still be dangerous when it blooms. And it's hard to see here, but they have these short little spines coming off. So all these are chained together right here. All these little circles are one individual phytoplankton chained together. And the reason they do that is because they are trying to stay afloat. More surface area, they'll stay floating at the surface, near the surface longer. So if you have this chain here, all of these, they're almost like whiskers. Imagine if all of the water is filled with that. Those whiskers get caught in fish gills. It's almost like a saw blade to a fish's whiskers. So, you know, a saw blade to the gills, sorry. And the issue with that is that you're covered in that. The fish are just going to not be able to breathe. They're going to get cut up by all those little spikes on these phytoplankton, and that is an issue with that one. So even though some of these phytoplankton blooms are not toxic, they still can be very harmful. So I'm going to kind of step out of the way and see if I can get some other phytoplankton on the screen. Feel free to type in your questions. Not many questions yet. But yeah, if you're wondering what else can you do to help this red tide and harmful algal bloom situation, you know, just other facts about it, I'll be happy to answer any of those questions. And this is magnified about 50 times here. So all of these things we're seeing are extremely small. You would not be able to see them without the help of a microscope, unless you have a massive bloom. Ooh, that one is interesting. So here it looks like we have another one that's almost chained together right there in the corner. Let's see what else we can find. Favorite phytoplankton to find. Thank you, Megan, one of our instructors here. I really like the pyrodinium, which is on that sheet that I put on the internet for you guys. Ooh, zooplankton right here. And the pyrodinium, it's cool, it's round, it's often spinning, moving a little bit, so cool to look at. So you will see a couple zooplankton here. You'll notice how much larger they are than the phytoplankton we're looking at. Zooplankton will commonly feed on phytoplankton. So a good question from Anne, our office coordinator. So she said, why was the red tide so bad 2 years ago, but not as bad as last year? And that is a very good question. I have a couple thoughts on that. And I would say one of them was that was shortly after Hurricane Irma. So imagine like you have a lot more waste and things getting dumped into the water. So that's one thought on that. And I do remember 2 years ago trying to go to the beach, it was like a months-long issue. And that actually got people to finally bring some awareness about this issue. Like, hey, what can we do to stop it? I saw a lot of news articles. I saw a lot of papers written about it. People were frustrated, understandably, because you can't go to the beach. You're coughing. There's dead animals everywhere. So there's some other factors that have to do with it as well. Some of it has to do with the currents in the wind. Is the wind dispersing the red tide, blowing it back off to sea? Or is it kind of pushing it inshore? So that can also influence how severe the red tide and harmful algal blooms are. So the common one around Florida, like the West Coast especially, is the red tide. But there are definitely tons of other harmful algal blooms that can affect the area. Some of them come from Lake Okeechobee and then get washed into the oceans. All right, see if we can find any other plankton. Otherwise, a couple more minutes and then we will be done. So if you're wondering what you can do, like I said before, don't fertilize as much. All right, you really don't need to. I know a lot of people like to have a perfectly green lawn, but just know that it's going to run off into the ocean. You're really not helping the ocean environment by doing that. And if you live in like a homeowners association where they spray all of the ponds and everything to make sure everything's dead in there, that's going to lead to more nutrients going in the water as well. I saw even people were contacting news stations when it was bad a couple years ago. You can contact your local politicians. You can just, get somebody to finally pay attention to it. That's the biggest thing, getting awareness of these issues. This one actually is right there. That is a pretty cool phytoplankton. I think this one is a side view, but I think this might be the pyrodinium. It's kind of looks like a weird, almost flying saucer-like disc, but if you look on top, kind of spins. So people might ask, is it bad that we find some of these target species on here? Not necessarily, as long as there's not a ton of them covering. Like if we see nothing but one of these target species that we're looking for, that's a bad sign. Then we'd be getting more samples. We'd be sending in the samples to the experts. But right now, it doesn't look like there's a bloom of anything. Otherwise, we would really notice that. Ooh, interesting one right here. This one kind of looks like a blob. Hard to say what this one is just from that. Let me see if I can get the one above it a little clearer. It's hard to see. This one right here, though, I believe is number 9 if you have one of the ID sheets that was put online. It's called Pseudonychia. And that one is a target species, but like I said, we only found this one so far, so not necessarily an issue. All right, let's see what we got. I'll look for another minute or so, and then I will take any final questions, and then I will be out of here. Ooh, interesting one right there. Do I know what this one is? Not necessarily. It's hard to say. It doesn't look like it's on one of our target species lists, one of those top 10 ones that we have. But it is a type of phytoplankton. There's a lot of cool ones, and every time you look, you'll find something new. Some of them are slowly moving around, some of them are chained together, so they're very unique. All right, ooh, check out this right here. This could be the exoskeleton from zooplankton. It's definitely not a phytoplankton, huge, so yeah, it's some type of zooplankton, probably the exoskeleton of one. All right, let's see what else we can find. Another zooplankton. This looks like a copepod here. If you saw our last zooplankton lesson on last Thursday, the copepods, we did not magnify them as much. This is a much more powerful microscope. You can see how much larger they appear in this one, because we're probably like 30 more times magnified than we were in the other one. So yeah, this is a huge copepod. It also puts into perspective the size of these phytoplankton, how much smaller they are than the zooplankton. So, a question from Megan. Have we ever found a bloom at Marine Lab? I would say not out on the water necessarily, not a bloom, but in our lagoon I have seen an elevated amount of the Catasaurus, which are the ones that have those spines. This was the first one I showed you. I wouldn't consider it a bloom, but there was definitely an elevated amount. And like I said, if there's too many, it can be harmful to fish. It can kind of shred up their gills. All right. Any last questions? I'm kind of disappointed. We only had like 17 viewers. I'll give it maybe because it's a Friday. People didn't want to be online, but we'll chalk it up to that. But thank you all for tuning in to Citizen Science Week. You can give a big thanks to Anna, our instructor here. She put this all together. She's the Citizen Science, she's in charge of that. So she did a great job with it. Hopefully you all learned something if you've been keeping up all week. And if you have any last questions, I'll be on for a couple more minutes to answer them, or we'll answer them in comments. Otherwise, hope you all have a good weekend.